Well, welcome everyone to the first lecture on closer reading. We are on the first step, placing in context. Now, I want us to think about placing in context a special way. One way to look at it is to think of context as a bunch of historical and outside material that you have to research and bring to bear on the poem. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes such research is worth doing. However, that can seem pretty laborious and boring. I want us to think of context rather as not this outside information, but as a conversation. Many of the best poets lived their lives in conversation with poetry. John Keats is one of the best examples of a life just spent, absorbed in poetry. John Keats's friend Charles Clark lent a copy of Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene to Keats. Now, Charles says that Keats's first encounter with the book was like a young horse running through a meadow. He went through it ramping, he says. Keats just devoured the book, and he returned to it throughout his life. One of the things that really captured Keats's imagination about Spenser was Spenser's epithets. Now, an epithet is a short description of a scene or an object or a person. Now, such epithets show how inventive Spenser was. You have the phrase, a troop of light-footed Naiades, blood-red billows. Spenser describes a horse as a froth-foamy steed, and he describes a sword as a bright, dew-burning blade. All of these are really inventive epithets that Keats entered into conversation with. One that Keats loved so much was sea-shouldering whales. Clark mentions how Keats sat up as he was reading the book and said, "What an image that is! Sea-shouldering whales, whales shouldering the sea, the way a soldier might carry a pack." It was a very thought-provoking image. Now, Spenser's art of the epithet influenced much of Keats's own writing, and some of Keats's epithets constitute a large portion of Keats's own contribution to the English language and English poetry. Now, just to look at some of Keats's own epithets that he would go on to write, we have his famous sonnet, "When I have fears that I may cease to be." We have several epithets included. In fact, see if you can find them. The poem reads, "When I have fears that I may cease to be before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before high-piled books in charactery hold like rich garners the full ripened grain, when I behold upon the night's starred face huge cloudy symbols of high romance, and think that I may never live to trace their shadows with the magic hand of chance. And when I feel, fair creature of an hour, that I shall never look upon thee more, never have relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love, then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone, and think till love and fame to nothingness do sink." Can the sense of tragedy for a short-lived beauty be expressed more poignantly than in this epithet, "fair creature of an hour"? Beautiful description of the fleetingness of beauty, partly what this poem is about. We have other epithets: the high-piled books, the magic hand of chance, another epithet, unreflecting love. This seems to me an epithet. So you can see how Keats really relished Spenser's epithets and how he was inspired to advance the epithet tradition in his own poetry. Now, this is the product of a life spent in conversation with poetry. Keats's poem is in a way an exchange. The poem itself is in conversation with other poets, drawing on earlier modes of communication and reinventing them, and furthering this poetic program of figurative language, of rich description, and of imaginative power. So it's this conversation between the poems that I want to highlight here as a kind of context. George MacDonald, the Victorian critic, said in his England's Antiphon, a collection of English poems, he wrote, "We must not forget that although the individual song springs from the heart of the individual, the song of a country is not merely cumulative. No man could sing as he has sung, had not others sung before him." And so placing in context is really about reading poems not as isolated individuals, but as members of a community, members of a living tradition, and this is what we see in Keats's poem here. Now let's talk about the different kinds of conversations that poems can have with each other. Great American essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "There is no history, only biography." So let's start with biography, and one great example of a poem with a biographical context that has captured the imagination of readers for a long time is Sir Thomas Wyatt's Whoso Lists to Hunt. Thomas Wyatt lived in England during the 15th century, served under King Henry VIII, and this poem, like Keats's poem that we just read, is a sonnet, a 14-line poem made up of iambic pentameter, usually with a tight rhyme scheme. Sir Thomas Wyatt was one of the first to introduce sonnets to the English tradition. Now, sonnets are pretty easy in Italian because they rely primarily on rhymes, and the Italian language is rich in rhymes. There are many rhymes in Italian. But in English, it's not so easy. But Thomas Wyatt showed what can be done in the English language with a sonnet. This one's called Whoso Lists to Hunt, which means whoever likes to hunt. Whoso lists to hunt, I know where is an ind. But as for me, alas, I may no more. The vain travail hath wearied me full sore. I am of them that farthest come behind. In this first quatrain, he's drawing on the English tradition of hunting. Usually what they would do is they would have the hunting dogs go before, and the men follow the dogs who are following the hare or the fox or the deer. And the speaker of this poem is saying that he's falling behind the chase. Yet may I by no means my wearied mind draw from the deer, but as she fleeth afore, fainting I follow. I leave off, therefore, sithens in a net I seek to hold the wind. Who list her hunt, I put him out of doubt, as well as I may spend his time in vain. Engraven with diamonds in letters plain there is written, her fair neck round about, Noli me tangere, for Caesar's I am, and wild for to hold, though I seem tame. Placing in context can help understand some old words. This means alas. It's a French version of alas. A hind is a deer. List means desire. Hind is really a doe. Alas, it is an expression of lament. Sithens means since. Vain means pointless, futile. Let's see, do we have any else? Travail. Yeah, travail means hardship or a tough endeavor. The vain endeavor hath wearied me or tired me. So what's being said here? But what's the sense of the poem? Whoever likes to hunt, I know where there is a doe. I've tried to catch her, but the vain endeavor has wearied me. But I can't stop, he says, yet I may by no means my wearied mind draw from the deer, but as she flees ahead of me or afore, fainting I follow. I leave off, therefore, since in a net I seek to hold the wind. There's a figurative phrase for the vain travail, catching the wind in a net. A euphemism that's still alive today. You'll still hear that sometimes. So he says here, which is usually where the volta is, whoever likes to hunt, I'll put them out of doubt that they will spend their time in vain just like I have. Why? There is written around her neck, Noli me tangere, which means do not touch me. For Caesar's I am, and wild for to hold, though I seem tame. What's interesting about this sonnet from a biographical perspective is that a lot of scholars, a lot of readers, have wondered whether Sir Thomas Wyatt is talking about Anne Boleyn, who would become the wife of King Henry VIII. Is she the deer here? For Caesar could be another word for saying the king's. She belongs to the king. One of the reasons why scholars think this has enriched the poem, in a sense, is that Sir Thomas Wyatt himself was imprisoned, along with others, under suspicion of having a past love affair with Anne Boleyn. So there is some evidence to suggest that Sir Thomas Wyatt and Anne Boleyn were at least acquainted, and perhaps were lovers in the past, before Anne Boleyn was married to King Henry VIII. At least that was what he was imprisoned for under suspicion. We don't know if that's the case, but that context has really enriched this poem. Now, I've just described the particular context of a poem, and there are two main aspects of a poem that determine its greatness. It's particular and it's universal. The particular is what is specific to the historical moment, or to a specific location, or a series of events. The universal is that which is applicable everywhere. So we've seen how this might have a particular context within Wyatt's own life, but what's the universal context? You say, well, I don't hunt deer. I have no interest in hunting deer. I'm not a deer hunter. But I bet we all have our hinds that we're chasing after, whether it be an unrequited romantic love, or some ideal we're chasing, something lost long ago we're trying to recover, perhaps, and yet cannot. This is the universal appeal of the poem. So all right, we've explored the biographical and historical. We kind of lumped those two all together. Now let's consider another kind of context. Sometimes contexts can come in the form of an allusion. Now in English literature, most allusions are either biblical or classical allusions, allusions to biblical texts or classical texts. A good example of a classical allusion comes from Shakespeare's play Romeo and Juliet. Romeo is speaking to Benvolio about his early love, Rosalind, and he describes Rosalind, this is early in the play before he meets Juliet, he describes Rosalind, she'll not be hit with Cupid's arrow, she hath Dian's wit. In classical mythology, we know that Cupid is the god of love. But who is Dian? Dian, or Diana, is a huntress who lived in the forest. The particular allusion here with Dian might be in Ovid's version of the telling, where a hunter stumbles across Diana bathing in a pool, sees her naked, she realizes it, and then transforms him into a deer, and his own hunting dogs kill him. So here's an example of a classical allusion that's really packing in these lines, and this is what allusions can do. It can really enrich the associations and meanings of a poem. What he's saying is, she'll not be hit with Cupid's arrow, she doesn't want to fall in love, and she's too clever to let a young man take advantage of her. She won't stand for unsolicited sexual advances, is what Romeo's saying here with this allusion. So sometimes allusions can pack in a lot of information in a small space. You know, some people say that allusions are just a way for the author to show off. And that he's just showing off how much he's learned. Is Shakespeare here showing off what he knows about classical texts? Not really. They were actually the opposite. They were a way for the author to communicate and draw upon a shared cultural knowledge. Almost everyone knew who Dian was and who Cupid was, so it was really an accessible thing. To us, however, we who don't read classical texts the way Shakespeare's reading public did, it seems like something to be overcome, an obstacle between us and the text, whereas really it was meant to be a bridge. And so sometimes it's just good to know that the author here isn't trying to show off, he isn't trying to make it difficult, he's actually trying to enrich the experience of communication for you. So let's look at biblical allusions. There's an interesting one here from Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, speaking to the raven, the man in his library. Prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent, or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate, yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore, quoth the raven, nevermore. Now there are a couple of allusions here. One might be prophet itself, in the Hebrew tradition, a messenger of God. A tempter might be the devil himself, or one of his angels. His home by horror haunted. Is there balm in Gilead? What's the weight of this question? Because that's what he's really asking the raven. Is there balm in Gilead? What is balm in Gilead? Well, it comes from the Old Testament of the Christian Bible, the Hebrew Bible, and Gilead was the land of cedars and firs, and a land of spices, and so balm was an ointment for healing. What the speaker here is asking the raven is there any healing? Is there any balm left in Gilead? And this is something that the prophet Jeremiah will ask. The answer is no. So understanding what exactly he's asking here requires some knowledge of the Bible, but also an understanding of how this allusion is working here. I think it's playing a couple of different ways, but that's specifically one way how that allusion is just enriching this stanza. Now, there's another kind of context that's important for collections of lyric poetry, and that is the collective context. So sometimes you'll have poems that are taken out of a larger collection and read in isolation, like Shakespeare's sonnet. But those sonnets are speaking to each other. Their placement is significant. And so if you miss that, sometimes you can misunderstand certain things that are being said in the sonnets. So in my close reading videos on Shakespeare's sonnets, I'll often talk about the interpretation of the poem within its own context as one poem among many in the collection. And other times I'll talk about the interpretation of this sonnet that it often has when it's taken up outside of that context. You can do that. You can take poems from, a larger collection of poems. But, for many of the sonnet cycles, for many of the poetry collections, like Herbert's The Temple, the placement of the poems are actually important. The first short lyric poem in George Herbert's The Temple is called The Altar. Why? Well, the first poem is a long didactic poem called The Church Porch, which are the steps leading up to the porch. The first lyric poem is the altar. So when you go to a country church or any kind of church, really you open the doors, you look down the aisle, and what are all the visuals doing? Well, the angles of the church, the pews and everything, they're all leading your eyes to the center of the church where there stands an altar. So the book itself, The Temple, by George Herbert, is in a way laid out the way a church would be laid out. And so that's just one example of how, if you're reading a poem from a collection of poems, you will have to read them in context or in order to get the full experience. Now let's talk about literary history. How does a poem speak within a larger literary context? When people read Shakespeare, for example, we who are used to watching Hollywood movies, we're pretty much unsurprised. But in Shakespeare's day, there was an understood rule of the three unities. There should be one action. It should take place in a 24-hour time period. The entire play should take place in one day, and it should take place ideally in one location. Well, what does Shakespeare do? You have plays that span 14 years, multiple threads and plots going on and subplots. And to Shakespeare's fellow playwriters, this was insane. To us, we think that it's not that crazy. And we find it very entertaining, as it is. But having an idea of where Shakespeare's coming in gives us an idea of his contribution. Wordsworth's poems don't seem very daring at all. He's writing about daffodils and daisies. That's boring. We've come to expect that. But in the late 18th century, to speak of a daffodil with the same diction that you would describe the throne room of heaven, for instance, was insane. It was radical. And it bothered a lot of Wordsworth's readers. And it took a lot for many of his readers to overcome that shock. So this is an example, too, of how what seems to us totally expected is simply because these new modes of art introduced by older poets were actually daring moves during their time, and now we take it for granted. Now, along those lines, let's look at some famous love poetry. Love poetry is difficult. Competitors are many, supplies are few. You have to be inventive to stand out, or you're just another bland love poem. Let's look at a Blazeon poem. Now, a Blazeon poem is a catalog of a woman's physical features, what the poet loves about her. It's a poem written in praise of the woman, of the subject of the poem. This type of poem was used by Petrarch, and many of the Elizabethan poets used it extensively. Edmund Spenser introduces, for what most of the poem is a pretty standard Blazeon. Ye tradeful merchants, that with weary toil do seek the most precious things to make your gain, and both the Indias of their treasures spoil, what need you to seek so far in vain? For lo, my love doth in herself contain all this world's riches that may far be found. If sapphires, lo, her eyes be sapphires plain. If rubies, Lo, her lips be rubies sound. If pearls, her teeth be pearls both pure and round. If ivory, her forehead ivory ween. If gold, her locks are finest gold on ground. If silver, her fair hands are silver sheen. But that which fairest is, but few behold. And here Spenser is actually introducing an invention. But that which is fairest, but few behold. Her mind adorned with virtues manifold. And this was, in a way, a turn from the Blazeon. Instead of just praising the physical features, let's have it accumulate up to the most beautiful feature of all, her mind. All right, having read the Blazeon poem by Spenser, let's turn to Shakespeare's Sonnet 130 to see what he does with the Blazeon. Here's where knowing the literary context will help. If we don't understand how tired and worn out the Blazeon is at this time, we might think that Shakespeare, or the speaker of the poem, is just being rude. And we won't appreciate the invention that's going on here. But what does he say, and how does he praise his mistress? The sonnet reads, "My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why, then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked, red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in such perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love is rare as any she belied with false compare." Now, do you see what Shakespeare has done with the Blazeon here? He's not deprecating his lover. He's actually professing what he thinks is, what he finds is sincere and genuine love. His she, or woman, is not belied with false comparisons, as in Spenser's sonnet. The poet is withdrawing from the figure of hyperbole, the exaggeration, in order to make what he finds is a sincere statement about his love for this woman. But again, thinking about how poems are speaking to each other, do you see how Sonnet 130 of Shakespeare is speaking to many poems within the Blazeon tradition, including Edmund Spenser's? Do you see how he's building, how they're talking back and forth? The more you read, the more you'll be able to hear those conversations. That's what context means. All right, let's continue with our study of love poetry by turning to the Cavalier poets of the 16th century. Who better to start with than Robert Herrick? The Cavalier poets were predominantly those poets who were royalists, meaning they supported Charles I in the Civil Wars. They also were mostly followers of Ben Jonson's poetry in that tradition, which was very classical. So we have this Cavalier of seizing the day, carpe diem. They were all about living life to its fullest. They weren't exactly of the reverent sort, but they wanted to be in the tradition of, Greek and Latin love poets, Sappho, Catullus, and others. Here we have a very well-known poem by Robert Herrick. "To the virgins to make much of time. Gather ye rosebuds while ye may. Old time is still a-flying. And this same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying." Now, do you notice how tomorrow follows hard upon today? The same flowers that smiles today, no punctuation, so it overflows today. Tomorrow, boom, it thuds into tomorrow, will be dying. It's a warning. It's this juxtaposition that's enacting the urgency. "The glorious lamp of heaven, the sun, the higher he's a-getting, the sooner will his race be run, and nearer he's to setting. The day is running out. Death is coming. That age is best which is the first, when youth and blood are warmer, but being spent, the worse and worst times still succeed the former. So, having in these three stanzas described the conditions under which one loves, that of urgency, death approaching, night drawing nigh, here we have the application. Then be not coy. That is, don't be shy. Then be not coy, but use your time, and while ye may, go marry. For having lost once your prime, you may forever tarry. Tarry here means delay. For once you've lost your youth, you have all the time in the world to delay. But you only have youth for a short period of time. So gather your rosebuds while you may. Okay, that's one supreme example of Cavalier carpe diem love poetry. Here's another that's interesting. Edmund Waller's song, Go Lovely Rose. Poet writes, Go, lovely rose, tell her that wastes her time and me, that now she knows, when I resemble her to thee, how sweet and fair she seems to be. The poet sends the rose on an errand. Go tell the one I love, who wastes her time and me, that the poet resembles her to thee, the rose. She is like a rose, in that she is sweet and fair. Tell her that's young, and shuns to have her graces spied. So in this stanza we reveal some things about the poet's beloved. She's shy. She shuns to have her graces spied. That hadst thou sprung in deserts, where no men hide, thou must have uncommended died. The rose is becoming an object lesson. Tell her that's young who's shy, that if you, this beautiful rose, had sprung in the desert where no one could see, then she would die. Then the rose would die unpraised. So, therefore, accept my praises, he's telling her. Going on here, small is the worth of beauty from the light retired. Bid her come forth, suffer herself to be desired, and not blush so to be admired. He's making a philosophical argument here, saying that beauty is worth nothing unless it is enjoyed. So let herself be desired, and implicitly enjoyed. Then die, telling the rose, then die, that she the common fate of all things rare may read in thee, how small a part of time they share, that are so wondrous, sweet, and fair. Finally, rose, teach her how short life is, and how short beauty is. Again, thinking of that fair creature of an hour that Keats would mention in his epithet. The rose here is a figure of the fragility of beauty and the fleetingness of life. And the poet is being inventive here by speaking to the rose and telling the rose how to use itself as an object lesson to teach this woman to love. Now, I want to show you some other poems. These are some of the best poems of this kind. Let's turn to Andrew Marvell's To His Coy Mistress, one of the best poems of this kind. This poem was composed around 1650, right at the kind of at the end of the Cavalier lyricist movement, but it's been the one that's really outlasted the rest. Partly because of how original it is. Now, you don't understand how original this poem is being until you have a sense of the love poetry that came before it. The argument has three movements. He says, had we but world enough in time, this coyness, lady, were no crime. We would sit down and think which way to walk, and pass our long love's day. If we had all the time in the world, and we had all the world of the world, it would not be wrong to be so shy. He imagines now what it would be like to have all the time and the world. Thou by the Indian Ganges side should rubies find. I by the tide of Humber would complain. I would love you 10 years before the flood, and you should, if you please, refuse till the conversion of the Jews. The conversion of the Jews was a millennial belief that towards the end of time, before Christ's coming, there would be a mass conversion of the Jews. That's what's mentioned here. You can wait until really the end of time, had we had that much time to waste. He goes on, my vegetable love should grow faster than empires, and more slow. 100 years should go to praise thine eyes, and on thy forehead gaze. See, now he's saying, if we had world enough and time, I would compose a Blazeon, so long and detailed that no part of you would be missed. Thine eyes, and on thy forehead gaze. 200 to adore each breast, but 30,000 to the rest. An age at least to every part, and the last age should show your heart. You see, he's doing that thing that Spenser was doing in the Amoretti Sonnet 15, where he saves the best for last. And what's the best? Not a physical attribute, but the heart. For, lady, you deserve this state, nor would I love at a lower rate. He says, I'm not rushing because I think you're cheap. I'm rushing for another reason. We don't have all the time in the world, and here's the conclusion of the first movement, the hypothetical situation, if there were time, and then the turn at reality. Here's the second movement. But at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. And yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. Thinking of course, I'm not sure if he has this in mind, but the deserts remind one of Edmund Waller's desert, in which the lonely rose is blooming with no one to see. Thy beauty shall no more be found, nor in thy marble vault shall sound my echoing song. Then worms shall try that long-preserved virginity, and your quaint honor turn to dust, and into ashes all my lust. The grave's a fine and private place, but none, I think, do there embrace. Here is the argument and force. The speaker is saying you cannot protect that which you want to protect, because if you withhold it from me, then death will take it. Your chastity, your virginity will be spent either by your own volition upon me, or death will take it. Now, if Marvell had ended this poem here, it would be a great poem of two very beautifully crafted movements. And the argument implicit here, that we should love now, would be finely expressed. But he doesn't end there. And here comes the third movement, the application. Now, therefore, while the youthful hue sits on thy skin like morning dew, and while thy willing soul transpires at every pore with instant fires, now let us sport us while we may, and now, like amorous birds of prey, rather at once our time devour than languish in his slow-chapped power. You see what's happening here? The poet is giving agency into the act of love. The poet is giving agency to the act of love. It is, in a sense, an act of rebellion, because notice the urgency too. Now. Let us devour our time the way we want, otherwise time will devour us. Let us roll all our strength and all our sweetness up into one ball, and tear our pleasures with rough strife through the iron grates of life. Thus, though we cannot make our sun stand still, yet we will make him run. Notice too how the meter is racing to that logical conclusion. Now, therefore, while the youthful hue, it's got that octosyllabic rhythm that's quickening here with the monosyllables, sits on thy skin like morning dew. You see how before the meter was, when you read it, it was at an easy pace, with lots of punctuation, but here at the end of the poem, things start picking up. The final verses here accumulate all the energy of the prior argument into this conclusion. Whereas before, at the hands of death, you have no agency, but in love, you have the ultimate agency. You can take control of your fate. transforming love into almost an act of rebellion against nature and death. You see how this last bit, this last movement, really transforms the argument into something new. He goes somewhere where we weren't expecting. And so this is why this poem is the supreme Cavalier Carpe Diem example of a love poem. But you have to understand that Cavalier tradition. You see how Marvell is speaking to it, speaking to other poems. Or the poem itself is speaking to other poems, an entire tradition, echoing older love poetry, drawing upon old and worn-out tropes to invent something new. So we see how Marvell's poem is a poem that could not have been written without close acquaintance to other poems. And this is no detriment to Marvell's genius. We're not saying, oh, look, here's where Marvell got this, here's how he got that, oh, he's really just stealing from other poets. No. Genius is not inventing something sui generis out of nothing. No, it's the ability to combine and to create something new, which is exactly what Marvell is doing, which is exactly what all great poems do. They draw upon older poems and they invent in conversation with those poems. And such was the life of John Keats, just to circle back to where we began. His was a life in conversation with other poets. Unfortunately, it was a tragically short life. He had become stricken ill in 1819, and by the beginning of 1820, it was clear to him that he was going to die of tuberculosis. He had traveled to Rome in hopes that the air would make him better, that the air would cure him, but it did not. As Keats lay in a corner room in Rome, next to the Spanish Steps, he was listening night after night to this constant play of water outside his window in the fountain. And these words kept coming back to him from a play he had read long ago by Beaumont and Fletcher. It's from Philtaster. All your better deeds shall be in water writ. And this was playing over and over in his head. All your better deeds shall be in water writ. Finally, a week before Keats died, with this playing in his head, he told Joseph Severn, his friend who was there with him, that he wanted no name on his gravestone, but only these words: here lies one whose name was writ in water. And that's the famous phrase that's on Keats's tomb today. So if you go on the outskirts of Rome, out to the Protestant cemetery, you'll see Keats's tombstone with that engraving on it. That very famous engraving. Most people know that, but they don't know where it comes from. In a way, his own final words are a testament to how much his life was in conversation with poetry. And we can see that through his poems. And so the more you read, the more you'll be able to hear poems speaking to each other, sometimes across centuries. A life spent in conversation, this is what placing in context offers us. It invites you into the community of poetry. Each true poem is always speaking within a company of other poems. Each part is often intimately connected with a whole other tradition. And as you read, the more experience you gain in poetry, the more you'll be able to hear this conversation between poems. And when you read closely, you can hear them speaking to each other. Thanks for joining me on this lecture. I'll see you in the next lecture on observing words and language.